There is a good mapping, but not a complete mapping between what the IPCC report says about climate science and what this report says about climate science. But let me just give you some very high-level perspectives on the report finding. One of the super strengths, I think, of this particular assessment was the extensive regional analysis of climate trends. And we are now getting requests for this information to be downscaled even further to the state level. This is a picture of temperature change over time relative to a reference period, which is 1901 to 1960. And you might understand why people in the Southeast would say that there might not have been as much climate change as people in the Northeast, Alaska, Southwest, and so on. There is texture to this data, and it's important to recognize that. And the Northeast has a striking 71% increase in heavy precipitation. It is significant and well outside of natural variability. The western part of the country, not so much. And projections are that it's going to get worse with time. This is interesting, and this is kind of cutting edge and hotly debated science. So there are two figures here. The one on the right is an example of how extraordinary the 2011 summer in Texas was. 2011 is here. Everything else, including the Dust Bowl period, are in that cluster. And this is just a coast-to-coast 100-degree day map in 2011 as well. The projections are that 2011 anomaly is not going to be that unusual towards the end of the century in certain parts of the country. The projections are based on scenarios. We have both climate and sea level rise scenarios, and they are separate. Notice that there is variability in each of the projections associated with how the models deal with various details of the climate system, including clouds. So this is our workhorse set. The RCP 2.6 actually has a significant policy component involved in it. The RCP 8.5 is kind of a business as usual. We use those scenarios, and then we began to think about issues of uncertainty associated with these scenarios. What this graphic is showing is sort of end of the century, last 20 years or so of this century, projected precipitation by season with the high emission scenario. So this is kind of business as usual, and we are on the business as usual track plus right now as a global entity. The brown shades are decreases in precipitation as projected by 15 or so climate models. The blues are increases. The darker the blue, the greater the increase. So these models said, we just can't tell you for this big wide area what is going to happen. Kind of the take-home message is the wet areas are going to get wetter generally, the dry areas are going to get drier. There's substantial uncertainty in our ability right now to predict precipitation in a significant belt across the middle of the country. Here, sea level rise, our projected range of 1 to 4 feet is still holding in our estimates of sea level rise globally. A scenarios analysis done by NOAA that suggests that if you're risk averse and you recognize the uncertainty, especially at the high end, associated with glacial mass in Greenland and the Antarctic, a worst case scenario for this century might be over 6 feet. And one of the important services that is highlighted for ecosystems, including important coastal ecosystems, is the capacity of these systems to buffer extreme events. And when you lose those systems, you lose that buffering capacity. The other important point that is made throughout the impacts sections of the report is a focus on the interactions of multiple stresses. Climate change occurs in the context of a bunch of other things, whether it's acid rain or land use pressures or whatever it is. And we talk about warming and acidification and their interactions and what this means for food web structure in the ocean, what it means for distribution of fisheries, and so on. And we also highlight how the warming and the acidification interact with other stresses like coastal eutrophication with nitrogen, for example, to really upset the ocean as a system. One of the take-home messages from the adaptation chapter is a lot of planning, some action, a lot more action needed. They point out that very often adaptation is done for reasons other than climate change. So there's a win-win aspect to that, which is important. They point out that you want to consider this concept of multiple stresses when thinking about adaptation, and you want to look at the composite threats as well as the trade-offs among costs, benefits, and risks of available options. There's a major effort in the U.S. Global Change Research Program to develop a global change information system that provides access to a lot of this data. And if you can build the capacity of people to use the data, then it's truly a win-win. And finally, there is a major move afoot to promote partnerships, public-private partnerships that would encourage the use and interpretation of national climate change information. And we've started a network, we call it NACANet, and it has a URL down at the bottom. And we currently have about 100 members of this NACANet organization, businesses, NGOs, academic organizations, who are getting together to think about how they are going to use the National Climate Assessment, how they're going to help communicate it, and what kinds of projects they might want to start on their own. There are a couple of things that keep me up at night. One is the global nature of the problem. And even if we were to decide to take heroic unilateral action, we wouldn't be able to completely solve the problem. You look for world leadership in this kind of a problem, which is a longer range problem, immediate for some people, totally transparent to others. Number two is the whole question of what is going to happen with those ice sheets and how long it will be before they're even a much more serious problem than we think they are now. And the third thing that worries me is for the last 20 years, I've been tracking what a warmer forest soil might mean to feedbacks to the climate system. And the idea being that warmer soils would result in more soil organic matter decomposition, the release of CO2 to the atmosphere. The more CO2 I release from warm soils, the warmer it gets. The warmer the soils get, the more CO2 they release. And we're also beginning to see shifts in the microbial community structure, such that microbes that seem to be making a living out there now are microbes that can break down more difficult to decompose soil organic matter. So what we thought might be safe just because of its chemical composition sitting in the soil, like humus or things like that, may not actually be all that safe. Or the self-reinforcing feedback could occur, and it could be ubiquitous. It's not like a point source that you could close down. So we have a lot of potential to add carbon to the atmosphere from this soil warming phenomenon.